Thank you, Jeff. A lot of what I'm going to say is just reiterating in a way what Jeff's spoken about, but in terms of concentrating on the deafness part. So, who am I? I'm Paula Zalcberg. I'm a counsellor and I'm a family therapist. A lot of the work that I do is with deaf and hard of hearing individuals and their families. I'm also fluent in Auslan, which means that I work directly with my clients who sign. My signing clients really appreciate this because most of the time they have to have an interpreter with them. I work in private practice with both oral and signing clients, and this also includes consulting privately at some other schools around Melbourne that have deaf students. And even though I work with deaf and hard of hearing adults in individual, couple and family therapy, a lot of the work I do is with children, adolescents and their families. At the end of last year, I resigned from my position at St Mary's School for Deaf Children, where I worked for 7 years. And as far as I know, St Mary's was one of the first schools for hearing impaired children in Melbourne to appoint a permanent mental health worker with experience with deafness to counsel its students. The initial response from some staff members was about why a school needed a person specialising in deafness, when often the partner schools had their own welfare officers. Many of the issues that deaf and hard of hearing children present with are the same as that hearing children have, but deaf children also present with issues directly related to their deafness. And I'll talk more about this later. My presentation today is going to be a fairly practical overview of my work with deaf children, including children with Usher syndrome and adolescents, and hopefully highlight some of the issues that deaf or hard of hearing children present with. Even though I've had experience with some children that have Usher syndrome, from my understanding, the deafness often presents initially, and it's the main area of concern with small ones and infants. So a little bit about me. Originally, I worked as a teacher of the deaf for over 30 years. The last 10 years of which I worked in the area of early intervention. And fairly soon I realised the wonderful support parents and their deaf babies were receiving at an early age. Yet this support did not continue once the children entered the school system. Once children started school, there seemed very little ongoing emotional support, especially for their families. Choosing a school and then starting a school can be, in fact, a very emotional time for both the deaf child and his or her family. And even though a lot of my work involves individual counselling, as a family therapist, I believe strongly that it is essential to work using a systemic framework. System theory teaches us that individuals, family, and even larger social networks are always part of larger systems. And I feel it's essential to work with parents, siblings, extended family, teachers, teaching assistants, principals, and other professionals. These are all the people who are working with your child. Deaf kids often have extensive and often intense relationships with a number of professional systems, including school, medical, audiologists, speech therapists, and other service agencies. So everyone needs to understand the issues that may arise with deaf children, especially children with Usher syndrome, so we can all be better informed and therefore have a positive influence on your child. Often I spend much or more time talking with the parents and teachers or other professionals than I actually do with the child. And I get a very different perspective of the child's behaviour when talking to parents and teachers. And I feel this is an essential part of my service. I may see a child once a week or once a fortnight, but parents and teachers see them every day. So I believe very strongly in a collaborative approach to better the outcomes for all deaf children. Family therapy is very much related to attachment theory. That is how the child develops a meaningful and trusting relationship with his or her parents. The child attains physical and psychological safety through proximity with a parent who's available, sensitive and responsive to the child's various needs. while also repairing any relationship breaks that might threaten that sense of safety. With attachment security, the parent serves as a secure base, which provides the child the safety he needs to begin to explore and interact with his world. Attachment security enables a child to regulate fears in order to be free to learn from objects and events in his environment. And as the child matures, physical proximity becomes less necessary, while psychological availability remains crucial throughout childhood and adolescence if the child is to successfully proceed through the developmental milestones. This is critical in the emotional and social development of the child. Some parents develop a strong, healthy attachment with their babies, and others have a lot of difficulties, often related to their own upbringing and their current circumstances. Often when the family comes for counselling, none of its members are feeling particularly safe. Parents feel that they may be judged negatively and blamed for problems that their child may be manifesting. And this can produce feelings of guilt and shame. The child may not feel safe because he or she may be told they're going to counselling because of his or her behaviours. And the therapist's first task is to facilitate a sense of safety among all members of the family. So the therapist then needs to become the secure base, and all need to know that they're in a safe environment. Some parents feel the stigma of seeing a counsellor or a healthcare professional, and some parents feel a sense of shame if they feel their child needs to see a counsellor. Sometimes parents feel they have failed if their child or they themselves needs counselling. But in my experience, this is not the case. Growing up is hard to do, even for adults. And with deaf children and children with Usher syndrome, it can often be much more challenging. So often I receive a referral from a teacher or a parent who's concerned about a child. The teacher or the parent may have a hard time trying to convince the child to come and see the counsellor. And I always say, if you can get their foot in the door, I will do the rest. And so far, I've not had a student who didn't come back for a second or third or fourth visit. A lot of this reluctance is based on the stigma and false belief there must be something seriously wrong to see a counsellor. But again, every issue that is important for the family is also important for the counsellor. Deaf kids and kids with Usher syndrome often feel, why me? It's not fair. Counselling can often help in accepting themselves and making their lives fun and fulfilling, and it can create a feeling of empowerment, especially as their vision starts to deteriorate. Sometimes therapy can be a few sessions. Other times, when more complicated issues present, it can be ongoing. There are some kids that I see from time to time, and there are other kids that I've been seeing regularly for many, many years. Counsellors are not about blaming. Therapy involves exploring different pathways to manage the world, to make it a safer place for all of those involved. And as Jeff said, there is help out there, and it's important for you as parents to receive that support if you feel you need it. Don't wait. The earlier you identify issues that may be affecting your child, the easier it is to provide therapy and strategies that may help him or her in their future. Often I get parents come to me with a 15-year-old that's acting out, and I say, a lot of these issues were present when the child was 6 and 7 and 8. It's much more difficult to help a child of 15 than it is an 8-year-old. So often when parents receive the news that their baby is deaf, or especially if they have Usher syndrome, it can elucidate huge heartache, grieving and loss for the perfect baby they no longer have or hope for. This is a really normal reaction and can happen to any parent when they receive news there may be something wrong with their newborn infant. Some parents need a long time to grieve and understand the impact of hearing loss and blindness on the future of their baby. This is a time of great heartache, feelings of guilt, anger, and even rage. Questions come up. Why us? Why my child? Will they be able to go to school? Will they be able to ride a bike? Will they get married? Will they go to university? And I'm sure this has been for you as parents the most difficult time of all. Sometimes these overwhelming feelings can cause some parents to become distant from their deaf or usher's baby, which makes the bonding between mother or father and baby to be inconsistent and sometimes fragmented. Many parents don't even realise in this grieving process that this is happening. When there's insecure attachment, it may cause the deaf or usher's child's social and emotional development to also be insecure, delayed and fragile. This has a huge impact on your child's understanding of the world, their ability to trust, and their ability to have meaningful relationships. It's important to note that 90 to 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents who have never had much or anything to do with deafness before. And I'm sure most of you here have had that experience. Most of you as parents will not have had prior contact with any deaf people, especially other people with Usher syndrome. Eventually, many parents come to embrace a cultural construction of deafness, and others struggle with the notion of it as a disability. And some parents seem to get very stuck in the denial stage. Again, I reiterate that all these responses are normal, but it's up to you, the parents, to work through these stages and remember that you don't need to do this on your own. As this conference shows you, there is plenty of support. There is support, and I encourage you to use these supports as you need them, because often it can seem to be a lonely road, a lonely and frustrating road to raise a child with special needs. So I encourage you to support each other as you're doing now. And thank you for this wonderful conference.
Very good.
I worked with a teenage girl who also was on the autism spectrum, and the mother was having enough difficulty accepting her daughter's deafness. Then at age 4 she was diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum. And this mother refused to let me discuss her autism, not with her, and most certainly not with her daughter. She felt the deafness was enough to contend with, let alone putting another label, as she put it, on her. This child at that time was having violent thoughts and was extremely angry at being born deaf, and I was very concerned for her. But it took me a long time to realise through some very difficult and emotional sessions that this mother was not and may never be ready to accept her daughter for who she truly is. This mother was adamant that these labels, if used, would define her child. Yet by not being able to discuss some of these critical issues, this girl remained confused and had little understanding of why social interactions were so difficult. Sometimes it's the parents who are stuck in the feeling of shame and guilt, and often this can take time to work through. One mother of a child with another syndrome told me it took her the best part of 10 years to stop feeling so guilty. Because of that, she found it difficult to establish secure and firm boundaries with her child. She said she felt bad saying no to her child. Her child's now 16, self-harming, school refusing, and is very depressed. Deaf children, just like hearing children, need firm boundaries to feel that their world is a safe place. It's about recognising and acknowledging your pain as parents, as having a child with a disability is not your fault. It's critical that you know this and you feel this and work towards acceptance. Acceptance of your child, and especially be kind to yourselves and caring towards yourselves. When this occurs and the fear somewhat diminishes, your relationship with your ushered child can be incredibly strong and powerful. I often say to my students, deafness does not define you. It's only one part of who you are. Yes, it's a big part because it impacts on lots of different areas of your life. But it should not stop you from having a fulfilling life the same as any other hearing person. The topic today is about building strong families, and this of course includes siblings. As a family therapist, I consider the entire family in my counselling, which of course includes the siblings of deaf or Usher's children. Many hearing siblings have spent the first few years of their lives being taken to many different appointments centred around the deaf or the Usher's child, doctors, audiologists, cochlear implant appointments, speech therapists, early intervention, and the list goes on. Parents are often anxious, worrying about fluctuating hearing losses. Will my child speak? Should I learn Auslan? So with all this to consider, what's the impact for siblings? Generally, children adapt very easily as long as there's good communication. Hearing siblings' level of adaptation depends on their parents' attitude and response to the disability, the extent of parental availability, and their own level of maturity and understanding. For normal sibling relationships to develop, there must be good and open shared communication. I think it's critical from an early age to speak openly about deafness, and in particular Usher syndrome, sight problems, balance problems, to both your Usher's child and to her siblings. When I say speak openly, I mean not only about hearing devices, hearing aids, glasses, but about how it feels for the Usher's child and his or her hearing siblings. For example, your brother has Usher syndrome and he needs to wear hearing aids to hear better, but he still can't hear everything. It's really hard when you call him and he doesn't answer. You must feel so frustrated at times. And your brother must feel like he's being left out some of the time. Speaking openly and explaining Usher syndrome to siblings is critical and makes them feel included in conversations and in problem solving. If Usher syndrome becomes a secret and not talked about in immediate or extended families, it causes feelings of shame to surface. And in many cultures, this can be particularly challenging to confront, but it needs to be addressed to build healthy self-esteem in your Usher's child. It's also important to note that deaf kids, and certainly Usher's kids, get more tired than their hearing counterparts. Deaf kids are always thrilled when I advise parents to give them a day off from time to time, or let them watch TV or go on their iPad after school. They need time out, where they don't need to concentrate that hard, where they don't need to listen and look the whole time. I was working with a family with two daughters, and the older child's 9 and her sister's 7. The 7-year-old has a moderate to severe hearing loss and wears hearing aids. And the hearing child complains that her sister is so annoying, which is pretty normal. But when I questioned her about this, she complains that the sibling always butts into conversations and asks all the time, what's going on? What's he talking about? The hearing sibling knows that her sister's deaf, but has the opportunity in my sessions to vent her frustrations. This is important for them as well. She often says, I wish she wasn't deaf. I appreciate that it's a very difficult job for you as parents to balance this common problem. So in my sessions, I allow both kids to talk about what we can do to lessen the frustrations for each of them. And it may be changing the seating arrangements in the car or around the dinner table. It may be explaining to the hearing sibling that if you call twice and there's no response, it maybe means your sister hasn't heard you, not just ignoring you. Maybe you could go and get her and tap her on the shoulder. And often I have complaints from the deaf child that everyone is always angry with them. Why? We call children once, twice, then her voice gets louder and more intense. Johnny, Johnny, Johnny! And all the deaf child hears is the last shouting, frustrated voice. I was working with a 22-year-old deaf girl who told me that when she was younger, she always thought that she was in trouble because her parents always yelled upstairs to her in what she perceived as an angry voice. Just something to be mindful of. Often parents tell me they feel caught between being fair to both the deaf child and his or her siblings. And as you all probably know from experience, the primary school years are all about, it's not fair. And so often I recommend a special time of day to spend with the hearing siblings so they can so that their feelings of jealousy, neglect are moderated, and you may often need to spend more time sometimes with your deaf child because he has additional needs. So they also, just to be mindful that they also need special time. Another thing, it's also important that siblings do not talk for their deaf brother or sister, because this can cause frustrations on both sides. The deaf child can become very disempowered, and their hearing siblings can feel resentment and pressure towards their deaf brother or sister. Siblings have a socialising effect on one another, and their interactions teach negotiation, compromise, and other problem-solving skills. Families are so important in understanding the experience of deaf children and their hearing siblings. There is also the social stigma where siblings may not want their friends to know that their brother or sister is deaf or has Usher syndrome, for fear that the sibling will be treated badly or just differently. I was working with a 15-year-old girl who has 2 hearing siblings and 1 deaf sister, and her deaf sister is only 1 year ahead of her at school. The girl I'm working with has very good speech, but her deaf sister doesn't. And this girl's finding it difficult to feel accepted at school for fear that kids will judge her sister as being disabled, and then they'll also judge her. And the good news is that siblings of children with deaf or hard of hearing may exhibit many positive traits, such as great levels of maturity, tolerance of differences in other people, patience, empathy and pride in helping their parents with their brother or sister with a hearing loss. If they use Auslan, a great sense of pride in being able to teach friends how to sign. I'm now going to talk about fathers, and when I use, and I'm happy to see that there are some dads in the audience here today, when I use the term father, I'm using it to represent a person who has assumed the father role within a family. So this can include biological fathers who live with or away from their child, stepfathers, adoptive and foster fathers, brothers, uncles, grandfathers, anyone who's a male figure in that child's life. Many fathers of deaf children do not receive the same amount of emotional support that their spouses do, and there are many reasons for this. Women still generally tend to be the primary caregiver of their children. When it comes to a deaf child, it's often the mother who attends various and many lengthy appointments. Some fathers or parents are not able to attend these appointments due to working flexibility. So often the information is passed on second-hand through the mother. I know when I worked in early intervention, I would have to make after our appointments if I wanted to involve the fathers. One mother of 4 children told me that often by the time she gets all the kids to bed, she either forgets to tell her partner or gives them a very abridged version of the information relayed at the appointment. So fathers are sometimes unsure about where they fit in. Often fathers or partners feel neglected as there are not many forums available to talk about their grieving or emotional well-being. Due to work commitments, fathers have few opportunities to meet other fathers of deaf children in different stages and ages. And even if they do, men generally don't seem to chat about these things like women do. I'm generalising now, but men often find it more difficult to ask for help, especially going to see a counsellor. I was involved with a support group of parents with children with disabilities, and the topics that always came up was discipline and fathers, separately and together. Often mum's got the kids to school, picks them up, takes them to activities, feeds them dinner, dad arrives home and dynamics change. Come on. Dad may get the kids overexcited when all mum wants to do is get them to bed. Dad may discipline in a different way than mum, and some of the mothers from the support group feel that they are being undermined by their partner. Others feel that they know their kids better and their way of handling a situation is the right way. My response to this is that there is no right or wrong way. There are better ways to handle situations, but in most cases the kids quickly adapt to mum's way and dad's way, and they often choose the soft option. Seriously, discipline issues are often the cause of many arguments between partners, especially involving children with disabilities, and may have a huge impact on the marriage. Some fathers want their deaf child to be like every other kid. I talked with a mother of a deaf child who was also on the autism spectrum, and His dad took him along to a footy clinic. He told the coach that his son was deaf, but he didn't tell him about his other needs. When his wife asked him why not, because she was scared he was going to have a meltdown, the father responded that he was just fine and he wanted him to manage like all the other kids. And if he did, would that make his son normal, like all the other kids? He still has his diagnoses. And all parents want their kids to have friends and fit in. But sometimes dads can be very anxious when this does not seem to be happening. And then they don't have the opportunity to discuss this with other people. Again, it's about open and honest communication and finding and making the time to sit down and discuss these issues when they arise. My advice to all couples I see is to make time for yourselves individually and together, reiterating what Jeff just said. When we have children, and especially when you have a child with special needs, life can become hectic with appointments, pickups, drop-offs, after-school activities, shopping. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day routine. So what gets lost is often emotional and physical intimacy. Women are often worn out carrying the bulk of childcare and can often start to feel resentment towards their partner. Again, making time to communicate is critical. Going for a coffee together, having a night away without the kids, if it's at all possible. Once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, plan something together and remember to have fun. Don't go out and talk about the kids. When life is challenging, it's so critical to create fun, because sometimes that can slip away from us and life tends to become very, very serious. How are we going for time? Let's skip it.
You're fine unless you want to take questions. So.
Okay, well, I've still got a bit more.
Keep going.
Good stuff.
Keep going.
Okay. I'm going to talk about what I see as one of the main issues for deaf children as they get older. And this is difficulty accepting their own deafness. And this is particularly relevant for kids with Usher syndrome. When I work with families of deaf children, I encourage parents to talk openly at a very early age with their deaf child about his or her deafness. Parents see audiologists or the cochlear implant team quite frequently as the child grows. And the parents get used to handling hearing aids and moulds and cochlears and devices, and they become familiar with hearing aid jargon. But what parents do not learn in these sessions is the language that's related to the child's emotional understanding about their deafness. It's so important that deaf children, siblings and their parents also understand this aspect of deafness. This is critical. Sometimes deaf children come home from school and say to their parents, "I hate being deaf." And often parents feel the child's pain and offer consoling words and encouragement like, "Don't worry, darling, you're the best runner in the class," or "You're really good at spelling." But this does not validate what the child is feeling. So I encourage parents to say, yes, it must really suck when you can't hear. That must be awful for you. You must get so frustrated at times. This is actually hearing your child and validating what he or she is feeling. And I also very much encourage deaf children to talk about their frustrations when they are constantly missing parts of conversations and feeling left out and socially isolated. If parents can communicate openly and honestly with their children about their deafness and Usher syndrome, it creates a trust and a feeling of being valued and accepted. When I work with deaf adults, it becomes quite obvious to me that many deaf or hard of hearing adults don't have the language or concept development to express exactly how they're feeling. So it's critical for you as parents to create that emotional language and their vocabulary so they can express exactly how they're feeling. So this brings me to my goals when working with deaf kids, especially adolescents, which is a critical time. Every child that I see has their own specific issues, but my general goal for all deaf or hard of hearing children is that by the time the child completes his or her school life, she can step into the world feeling comfortable about his deafness which means you can talk openly with people about it and not die of embarrassment. And my other goal is that the deaf young adult can advocate for themselves, which means she can say what she needs. I need an interpreter. Can you please not stand with the sun facing your face? I often say to kids who are struggling with accepting their deafness that you don't need to say that you love being deaf, but you can feel that being deaf is okay and acceptable and should not be a barrier to following your dreams. Recently I was at a deaf facility talking to a group of deaf and hard of hearing Year 9 students, and one of the kids had Usher syndrome, and I asked him if it was okay for us to discuss Usher syndrome with the group. The other deaf kids didn't know anything about it. He was a little hesitant, but later told me that it was the first time he had openly talked about it. He didn't want sympathy from his peers, but he did want understanding and acceptance. And initially he was a little embarrassed. But by being open and talking about his challenges as he's slowly losing his vision, he gained great respect from his group of deaf teenagers, and they received new insight into the challenges that this young man was facing. I'll skip this bit. Okay. When I talk to deaf or hard of hearing children, teenagers or adults, the words that always come up together with deafness is the word stupid. I can't tell you how many times it's been said to me, I feel like they think I'm stupid if I don't hear what they're saying, or if I laugh at the wrong time, or I miss the joke. And even these can be deaf kids who academically keep up with their peers, but they feel judged as being stupid. These deaf kids often walk around with so much anger and frustration that hearing kids don't understand them or know what it feels like to be deaf. And often kids say to me they would just like to swap places with their hearing friends just for a day, and maybe then they'll know what it feels like. And we all know that teenage years can be tough. And what do all kids, especially teenagers, want, as Jeff said, more than anything? To be acceptable, to fit in, and most importantly, not to be different. This is particularly hard for deaf kids. It's very hard to fit in when you have a hearing loss, and it's especially hard if you have Usher syndrome, because that makes you different from the start. So deaf kids use different strategies to protect themselves from feelings of rejection. And one of these is what we call the deaf nod. Yep, 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 yep. They all, yep, got it all. Yep, 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 yep. Because they don't want to keep asking over and over and over. The other comment I get from every deaf person I speak to, especially kids and teenagers, is when a trivial comment's made or a joke told and the deaf person doesn't hear it, and they later say, don't worry about it, I'll tell you later. Now this absolutely pisses deaf kids off because no one ever tells them later. And that happens not once a day. It can happen 5 times a day, 10 times a day, 20 times a day, every day of their lives. So that really gets under their skin. And just think about the impact of self-esteem. Today's topic is about building strong families. Family is the critical word. Your child lives in your family system, and initially you are the secure base for your child, and you are the most important people in your child's life. The impact of a relationship with your child teaches them how to view the world. Is the world a safe place for a child with Usher syndrome? And the answer should be yes. But it's up to you as parents to show your child that they can take healthy risks and not be scared. And you are the carriers of hope for your children. One of the most important jobs you have as parents is to build resilience in your child. We want all children to be resilient, but deaf and especially Usher's kids need to have a double dose. By understanding the issues I've described today, and by communicating openly and honestly, giving them firm boundaries and lots of love, giving them hope and a positive outlook goes a long way in developing resilience. Letting children solve their problems before stepping in to save them also builds resilience. Some deaf children have the core belief that the world is not a safe place, and your job as parents is to support your kids, be their advocates, educate teachers, school systems, as to the needs of your child. When they come home and say it's not fair that they have Usher syndrome, you need to put your fears aside and listen compassionately and help them to develop healthy self-esteem by problem solving with them and by validating what they're saying. Then they trust that you really hear them, really listen to your child. But the most important people in your family is you, the parents. And as I said before, life has a way of getting away from us. Time slips by and you haven't made time to have that coffee and have that night out. Intimacy wanes, arguments arise over discipline, financial worries, and life becomes serious and boring. Remind yourselves that doing something for yourselves individually and as a couple teaches your kids that you are worth it, and so are they. Go to the movies, do a yoga class, go to the gym, have a facial, get your nails done for the guys. Whatever you need, remind yourselves to have fun. Don't feel guilty putting yourselves first sometimes, because if you are in a good place, then you are a more productive and better, more present parent. So remember to look after yourselves and each other, to communicate. Don't let resentment and anger build up. Talk to each other and seek help if you need it, because you are the number ones. Thank you.